Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan and today I'm doing my 2010's All-Decade NHL team, ranking the best players of the decade and putting them all together on one team. Now the 2010's were a fantastic year for hockey, where we saw so many superstars do superstar things and so many new superstars come into the league. But which guys do I see making my 2010 All-Decade team? Which players make it and which players miss? For all my rankings and opinions, watch till the end to find out. Now I'll be making a new hockey team from scratch, basically assigning to me the best players of the 2010 decade. We'll go through all four forward lines, the defense pairings, and of course the best goaltenders of the decade. These are not exactly rankings because there are some guys that I would have higher, but of course there's so many freaking centers that they would have to be put on wing. So keep that in mind. And also I am missing some players here because there are so many good players of the 2010s. Guys like Joe Pavelski, Joe Thornton, that I could not have on this list. I will definitely miss, but alas, let's get straight into it. Okay, now starting us off in the first line of my 2010s team build, we're now going to get into my left winger to start out our forward lines. And to me, the best left winger of the decade was Alex Ovechkin. Now Ovechkin currently sits in this decade, the 2010s, with 715 games played, 406 goals, 303 assists for 709 points. 709 points, good for third in scoring this decade, and also he scored the most goals in this decade. Overall, just being an offensive dynamo, and also just being Alex Ovechkin. Now going out of the center for our 2010s first line, and of course, it's gotta be Sidney Crosby. Currently sitting in this decade at 589 games played, 268 goals, 459 assists for 727 points. That is second in the decade, and if he was healthy, he likely would be number one. Of course, it is Sidney Crosby, and this decade was his decade of being the best player for pretty much all of it, besides the last couple of years, of course, with Connor McDavid. But even with that, he's been Sidney Crosby, just like Alex Ovechkin has been Alex Ovechkin. They've dominated, they've been in their primes this decade, and it shows in the point totals. Now with Alex Ovechkin on the left wing, Sidney Crosby as center. Now going into our right wing for the first line on the 2010 team, I have Patrick Kane. He currently sits at number one in scoring this decade, the good old American, at 684 games, 293 goals, 447 assists for 740 points. Number one in scoring this decade. And obviously, Sidney Crosby played more games, he would be number one, but Patrick Kane currently leading in that department. He's been consistent, he's been solid, and throughout this list you'll see a lot of consistency. I like when players are good from the start all the way till the end of the decade, and to me you get extra bonus points for that. So you'll see that throughout the team as well. Now you'll notice that a couple of these picks have not played the full decade. There's some guys here that didn't go from 2010 all the way to 2020, so keep that in mind. And for a good example, we have my second line left winger, that being Connor McDavid. Now I know he's a center, I'm just going to put him on the wing because I just want to have him on this team. You could make a pretty great argument that he didn't even play half the decade, and I think that is fair. But to me, the decade, the half decade that Connor McDavid did play was so freaking amazing that he kind of almost has to be on this team. And I know he didn't play until 2015, okay? Just give me a friggin' break. Connor McDavid on this team. It needs to happen, man. Now, Connor McDavid on the left wing, now we go into my second line at center. And for me, it was not an obvious choice, but I'm going to pick Patrice Bergeron of the Bruins. Now, Patrice sits at 20th in point scoring in the decade, currently throughout the decade at 673 games, 230 goals, 327 assists, good for 557 points. But without the points is Patrice Bergeron. He won 4 Selkies this decade, and that alone is enough to be on this team. Now continuing the trend for centers on my second line. Going to my right winger for the second line, and I'm going to pick Steven Stamkos. Now Steven Stamkos, when he was healthy this decade, was an absolute force to be reckoned with offensively. In 605 games, currently sitting at 7th in decade scoring, he has 326 goals, 319 assists for 645 points. Now his style has dramatically changed from the start to the finish. He was a goal scorer, now he's pretty much an assist machine. But Steven Stamkos, throughout the decade, has been consistent, and when healthy, has always been great offensively. Now getting into my third line spot on the left wing, and I'm going to go with Brad Marchand in this spot. Currently throughout the decade, sitting at 15th in decade scoring, 687 games played, 280 goals, 321 assists for 601 points so far. And Brad Marchand's rookie season was 2010. He won the Stanley Cup the next season and has gotten better and better. All the dirty stuff aside, all the suspensions aside, he's been one of the best players in the decade and is one of the best NHL players, especially right now. Now going into the third line center for my team build, and going for Brad Marchand to Anze Kopitar ain't bad whatsoever. Now Kopitar, 11th in scoring in the decade, had 711 games this decade, 209 goals, 421 assists for 630 points right now. He won 2 cups this decade, won I think 2 Selkies as it stands right now. Not a bad decade for Anze Kopitar whatsoever and the LA Kings. And while I think his play has somewhat downgraded from what it was back in 2014 or even 2012, he is still one of the NHL's best players, and defensively is still up there with the greats. Now getting into my third line right winger, slash center. He changed positions basically midway through the decade, but I'm going to go with Claude Giroux. Now, Claude Giroux sits at 4th in scoring in the decade with 720 games, 219 goals, 487 assists for 706 points as it stands. And Claude Giroux has not been consistent this season. He's gone through multiple seasons where it's just like, what are you even doing? And then he changed position from center to a right winger. So it wasn't exactly the most ideal decade for him, but he still got tons of points, was still amazing overall for Philadelphia, and is still one of the best players in the NHL today. Now on to the fourth line for this team, and for my fourth line left winger slash center, I'm going to go with Nicholas Backstrom. Now, Backstrom is 9th in scoring this decade. Right now, 672 games played, and also 633 points to his name. And of course, he plays with Ovi, and it's been that way throughout the decade, but he started out the decade with over 100 points, starting that with a bang, won the Stanley Cup in 2018, so not a bad decade for him, to be honest. Now going to my fourth line center, and for this spot, I'm going to go with John Tavares. Now, John Tavares is basically here because he's a center. I wish I could put him on like the third line or something, but this team is just way too stacked that I have John freaking Tavares on the fourth line. But Tavares was able to get 5th in scoring this decade, right now at 689 games played and 673 assists. You know, not bad for him. Now getting into my fourth line right winger and another center, it just makes sense. I'm going to go with Evgeny Malkin. As I was making this team, I'm like, okay, how am I forgetting Evgeny Malkin and how am I not putting him on this team? And then I just put him on this team. He's on the friggin' fourth line of John Tavares and Nicholas Backstrom. And that's pretty good in my opinion. Now I'm going to give extra shout out to my extra forward, that being my boy Tyler Seguin. He just missed, but I would have Evgeny Malkin over him, at least for the decade as it stands. But still, that forward group is still freaking nasty. Alright, now we are on to the defense core for the 2010s, baby. And getting into my best defenseman of the decade, for my number 1 defenseman, and in my opinion, the best defenseman of the decade, I'm going to go with Erik Karlsson. Now, you guys know I love me some EK, I love me some Erik, but to me, he was the defenseman of the decade. Currently, 1st in scoring of the decade, 646 games played, 127 goals, 430 assists for 557 points. Good for the best defenseman point totals of the decade. And when you have that much upside, in my opinion, one of the best offensive skill sets a defenseman has ever had, you have Erik Karlsson, who's been so good with Ottawa, so good now with San Jose, and I still think was the premier defenseman of the 2010s. Now going to the other Swedish defenseman that challenged for that defenseman of the decade title, I'm going to go for Victor Hedman. Now Victor, currently 6th in scoring for the decade, had 643 games played and 419 points. But I don't usually like to mention points for defensemen, sometimes that's irrelevant. But with Victor Hedman on a team like Tampa, has been their quarterback throughout the whole decade. Ever since coming in through them, he's been a leader for them on and off the ice, and of course going to that Stanley Cup final in 2015, he was a big force on that. Overall, he's been one of the best defensemen in the decade, especially with his two-way game. Now going into the second pairing and my left defenseman here, and this is a good example of a player that I think was great for half the decade, and then pretty average for the rest, but he was able to make the defense core because of that decade that he played earlier, that being Drew Doughty of the LA Kings. Now, as a whole, I think Drew Doughty was still one of the best defensemen of the decade, of course being on the second pairing. But if we were making a list on the last half decade, he wouldn't even sniff this team. I don't think in the last 3 years he's been all that great, and we saw in the 2012 playoffs, 2014 playoffs, how good he was. And again, if this was just based off the first half decade, he might be in the top pairing, maybe even the best defenseman. But to me, that last half put him down a little bit. But he's still able to make the team because overall he still was good this decade. Now going on to my second pairing, a right defenseman, to a almost completely different example than Drew Doughty, I'm going to go with Alex Pietrangelo of the St. Louis Blues. Now, Alex Pietrangelo was consistent throughout the whole decade. I think being one of the league's best defensemen, and as a Dallas Stars fan, I can attest to how good he is. Drew Doughty, on the other hand, was inconsistent, but I think Alex Pietrangelo was able to get that cup at the end, obviously, with the Blues this past year, and was able to make it all worth it. But I think he's been one of the most underrated defensemen for a very, very long time. He's been that way for a very, very long time, and has been consistent the whole way through. Now going to a situation a lot more akin to Drew Doughty, I have for my third pairing defenseman on the left side, Duncan Keith of the Chicago Blackhawks. Now Duncan Keith was interesting this decade. Obviously he won those 3 Stanley Cups, 2010, 2013, and 2015. Being a beast, I would say in all 3 of those, honestly. He was a big force to be reckoned with. But towards the end of the decade, he's honestly been pretty terrible, honestly. There's been some points where I'm like, is Duncan Keith even a top 4 defenseman? Because some points there weren't. He is still getting points, and that is still fine, but Duncan Keith obviously isn't as good as he used to be. Now for my third pairing defenseman on the right side, I'm going to go with my good old American boy, John Karlsson. Now Karlsson sits at 4th in scoring in the decade with 693 games played, 433 points. Obviously won the 2018 Cup with the Washington Capitals, and that was a big part of it. But in the later half of the decade, he was even more of a force to be reckoned with. Offensively, he was good. And while I don't think he's ever been fantastic defensively, and I don't think he ever will be, I think he's overrated in that aspect. As an offensive defenseman, he's been one of the best of the decade, and the points do back that up. Now for my starting goalie for the 2010s, it was a hard decision, definitely, but to me it was Henrik Lundqvist. Of course, he played the most games throughout the decade with the New York Rangers, was brilliant for them, and had a 919 save percentage as well. When it comes to King Henrik, he went to the Stanley Cup final, and of course lost to the LA Kings unfortunately, but as a decade as a whole, he was in my opinion the best goaltender. When it came to consistency, when it came to always being elite, while he's definitely taken a little bit of a step back recently, I still think he's been one of the best of the decade and deserves to be at that spot. Has led New York to a lot of playoff berths, is one of the main reasons why they were so competitive throughout the decade, and has been the star for the Rangers for a long time now. But now getting into my backup goalie, and this is where it gets a lot more interesting in my opinion. And there was a lot of goaltenders that I could choose from because there was a lot of goaltenders that had similar stats. But to me, I'm a little bit biased here as a Stars and Lightning fan, I know. But I'm going to go with Ben Bishop, my boy. Now, Ben Bishop has a 921 save percentage this decade. Besides, like, Tim Thomas, that's the best save percentage of the decade. Now, he's played 381 games, which is a pretty great sample size. And with Tampa, the Stars, and the LA Kings somehow, he's been able to get the best save percentage of the decade. And also for my backup goalie, I gotta give some credit for Tuukka Rask because I think he's one of the NHL's best goalies and honestly has been one of the NHL's best. Currently, he also has a 921 save percentage, the same as Ben Bishop. You could go either or on that one. It doesn't matter. Both goalies are still elite. But with my team built for the 2010s, I need to hear y'all's thoughts down those comments down below. Let me know if I missed anybody on this list, who you would put and why. Let me know your team builds as well, and who do you see as the best players of the 2010s. But if you guys want some more Grav videos just like this one, I'm not sure exactly what to recommend because I've never really done something like this, but if you want more team build stuff like this, I recommend you watch this video where I predict Team Canada's World Junior roster. Make sure you watch that one because they're going to announce it pretty soon if I remember correctly, so get on that. But that'll be it for today, guys. If you guys did enjoy this video, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Again, comment down below your thoughts on my 2010s team, what you agree and disagree with, and which players you would like to see on this team as well. Share this video with your friends, get the word out there. The Grav gang is almost at 10K subscribers, boys. Let's get her done. Because I'm Nathan and I'll see y'all in the next video or stream. I'm not sure why I'm doing this, but goodbye.